Rich. Thank you so very much for that kind introduction. And I want to just say that I'm so happy to be gathered here on the unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. I also want to thank Elder Verna McGregor and for welcoming us to her territory. Chimigwech, Verna, thank you so very much. And thank you to Mary Nawagabo for singing the national anthem. Thank you so very much. I want to, before I begin, I have to just, I'm going home today finally. It's been a long 10 days, and but it was, one of the most important things, before we get into my speech, one of the most important things that as a young woman you kind of decide is if you want to have a baby or not, if you want to get married. And so I said to God, I want to have a baby, and I need a husband, and make sure he has degrees or a degree. So God did better, eh? My husband has a business degree and an education degree. And so I thought, okay, I'll choose him, I'll marry him, and we'll have our beautiful babies, right? So that was that. But last month, 2 months ago, was my birthday. And you got to be more specific when you ask God things, right? You got to make sure he's smart. So it was my birthday, and but a couple weeks before that, and I know what all of us are feeling it as Canadians, and I thank us all. It seems like we're stronger together because of the colonialism at our borders. And but during that time, I had a dream, and I said to him, honey, I dreamt of a watch and a ring. And he says, just wait until your birthday. So my birthday came, but I was in Washington trying to work with the tribes in the US to figure out the tough economic times that are going to be ahead of all of us. And I was down there. So I came home, and there was a box when it was like the day after my birthday. And so I went in, and my honey was there, and I said, oh, hi, husband. And he goes, yeah, I got you your birthday gift. And I said, oh, great. Well, he's so smart, right? So I opened my birthday gift and opened my present, and it was a book, How to Interpret Dreams. So he still owes me a watch. Well, I want to thank the Canadian Federation for Canadian Municipalities for the kind invitation to attend and speak to each of you today. And I want to congratulate the FCM on your many decades of advocacy, and the attendance here speaks volumes to your success. Look at this room. As a chief's daughter, I understand how hard your work is and the passion that you bring to servicing your communities. To paraphrase one of our great leaders, Justice Murray Sinclair, said this: you are being good relatives to the next generation by being at the front lines, by doing your important work. So I uplift each and every one of you, and I think you should give yourselves a round of applause. For those of you that don't know me, I am National Chief Cindy Woodhouse, and I represent the Assembly of First Nations. The Assembly of First Nations, we bring our greetings to each of you, and we represent 634 strong, independent First Nations from coast to coast to coast. And we are 1.5 million strong and growing. We're a fast-growing population. As a national political organization for First Nations, the Assembly of First Nations advances inherent and treaty rights through the co-development of policy, public education, and co-developed legislation. My role as National Chief is to advocate for First Nations priorities as directed by chiefs to protect those collective and inherent rights. It's an honor to be here on behalf of the many First Nations from across the country. I grew up surrounded by my family and my culture and my language in Penematang First Nation, just a few hours north of Winnipeg. And I also want to say hello to my mayor. I know I live in Ottawa during the week now, so I guess I kind of have two mayors. But Mayor Scott Gillingham, I don't know if you're here today, and of course the councillors. I've seen some of the councillors out there in the hallway today, and for the great city of Winnipeg. I also want to give a shout out to the Edmonton delegation, because I'm tired this morning because I stayed up last night with all of you on your great win. I was very blessed to have grown up with my loving mother and my father and my great-grandmother, who was, a widow at the time, and I had to spend some days with her. And I watched my mom, her white father, her and her Indian mother left her on the reserve, and she kind of just went house to house until my great-grandmother took her in, and I lift her up she's beaten all odds, and finished her education degree, and then she finished her master's degree. And I said, Mom, you had everything against you. And then you married the chief's son, and you were looked down upon because you didn't have parents. But I'm so proud of her. And I also watched my dad lead as chief in our home community. And he'd always stress the importance of the treaties. And the original treaty signatory was our ancestor, Chief Richard Woodhouse, who signed Treaty Number 2 in 1871. I see former Chief Dennis, if you can just stand up. This is a Treaty 1, one of our Treaty 1 chiefs, very influential. Treaty 1 and Treaty 2, and I'm so proud of you. I know that he's building within the city of Winnipeg the first, one of the biggest urban reserves, and so I'm so glad to see you here this morning. But without that gift of knowing where I come from, knowing that treaty was signed to create this beautiful country that we all share together, and being around my culture and my family, I couldn't be standing in front of you here today. I wouldn't have the confidence to do that if I didn't have a strong family and a foundation. And so before starting off today, we do want to say a word about the wildfire situation that's happening in our country. Getting many reports in Saskatchewan, Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba, and so many First Nations are impacted. And so we lift up the first responders across this country that are fighting these fires and supporting evacuees. I'll be flying home directly after this speech, to support these efforts in any which way I can so that I'm on the ground. I've been in touch with chiefs impacted, and we lift them up for all they're doing in response to this crisis. I had a good meeting with the Prime Minister yesterday, and I thanked him for the federal government's support. I know they are doing all that they can as well. I lift up the premiers, the mayors, the local councillors for their leadership. And in times of crisis like these, I'm so proud of us that we try pull together, and this is one of those times that we need everybody. And it's going to be, a long road ahead of us for the weeks ahead. Unity and in partnership, when we talk about partnership and unity, was a theme of King Charles's visit to Canada earlier this week. And so I speak to you today in that spirit of unity and partnership. Often when I explain First Nation governance to Canadians, people often ask, okay, so you're like municipalities. And some say that it's one of the worst things that you could say to First Nations leaders. And it's not meant any disrespect to municipalities. To me, it just suggests that we need to do a better job of reminding Canadians about how this country was founded, about the unique status of First Nations, of founders of this beautiful country. This reality is something you are all familiar with, because so many of your councils have taken up the truth and reconciliation calls to action. Your leadership is vital to the success of reconciliation and vital to the future success of this country, to make sure that we never go back. As we mark the 10th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's historic calls to action this next December, this is a good time to renew these efforts and measure progress. How far have we come? What do we have that's left that's undone? On common ground and prosperity for all, with an understanding that First Nations and municipalities are not in any competition for status, I would like to talk today about our common ground. One thing we have in common is Rebecca Alty, Canada's new Minister of Crown and Crown Indigenous Relations and the former Mayor of Yellowknife. We are very excited to welcome her as another strong woman in the federal cabinet, and we are very excited to work with her over the coming year in this important portfolio. Another place we have common ground is the theme of your conference this year, because it's about sharing prosperity. During the recent federal election, the Assembly of First Nations, we published a priorities document titled prosperity for all. Besides fitting the theme of your conference quite well, this document was intended to be a helpful guide for the next Prime Minister, Cabinet, and Parliament. Among other things, Prosperity for All document calls for long overdue investments in First Nations communities that will unlock significant economic growth and keep reconciliation moving forward in a good way. We focused on economic reconciliation as more than a moral and legal obligation for Canada. It's a strategic advantage for future generations. That was true before Trump 2.0, and it's even more important now. So at this critical time in this country's history, it is more important for all of us to recognize that Canada's gross domestic product is generated off First Nations lands and resources. First Nations have inhabited these territories long before colonial borders were established, regardless of what the US president may think. These lands hold vast deposits of critical minerals, forests, and fresh water supplies that help sustain communities on both sides of the medicine line. Over the next decade, over $500 billion of development projects are forecast on our traditional lands. The benefits are measured in the trillions of dollars, but they won't advance without First Nations support. So we stand with mayors and councillors across this country in strongly condemning the imposition of illegal tariffs by the United States government. From the War of 1812 and throughout Canada's history, First Nations have bravely fought for this country when it faced a crisis, and now is another one of those times, and we stand with you. Another thing First Nations and municipalities have in common is that we don't always see eye to eye with the federal and the provincial governments. First Nations are experiencing this again with the introduction of sweeping new laws related to the development of large natural resource projects. In particular, we lift up BC municipalities and BC chiefs that have been calling out the provincial government for their overreach in this regard. The same is true for Ontario. We heard the Ontario government say this week that the only people opposed to their proposal were radical environmentalists. This is so disrespectful to leadership, to chiefs, and local officials that have raised legitimate concerns about these fast-track bills on behalf of the people that they represent. First Nations are growing increasingly concerned that BC and Ontario model may be going national. The federal government has now stated their intention to introduce their own fast-track bill as early as next week. First Nations have not seen this legislation, so we will have to wait and see the full package, and we're waiting for that. With that being said, we are concerned about the limited information that we have seen so far. We do not believe the best way to beat Trump's colonialism is more colonialism here at home. Sadly, that may be what we are seeing with these fast-track proposals. We met with the Prime Minister yesterday and have promised to provide a more formal response to the limited summary that we have received to date. We will be consulting with chiefs and First Nations, but I fear that there's a chance that that may not go well. Another issue we discussed with the Prime Minister yesterday is something else I think First Nations and municipalities have in common: infrastructure. Unlike municipalities, however, First Nations have limited opportunities under the Indian Act in accessing many of the revenue tools at your disposal. Imagine something like the Sudbury City Council having to go to the Federal Minister of Municipal Affairs to get a bylaw approved to fix a broken water line. Sadly, the First Nations infrastructure gap has perpetuated deep-rooted inequality in Canada, and this disparity has led to poor health outcomes, limited education opportunities, and much less prosperity compared with other Canadians. So the benefit of addressing this discriminatory gap cannot be overstated. As we see in too many Canadian cities and communities, your government often pay the price when federal and provincial governments fail in their responsibilities to First Nations. Too many people sleeping on your streets are our First Nations, our First Nations, our brothers, our sisters, our mothers, our fathers, who have lost their identity, their connection to their community and their culture. Too many are victims, and you could ask them this, probably 99% of this, are victims of the racist child welfare system that picked up right where residential schools left off. And I have to say it before, but these poor kids on our streets that have no connection to our communities anymore, they don't know where they've come from. They've probably been in 100 homes. What are we doing in this country? We got to raise up our kids better, all of us, and we all have that duty. So the AFN released a series of reports over the past year with the federal government and the Conference Board of Canada to highlight this First Nations infrastructure gap as a nation-building project. Our first report last April captured the scale of investment required to close the gap by 2030. With the Government of Canada, we concluded that there was a total of $350 billion. In our November 2024 report, the Conference Board of Canada estimated the economic benefits to Canada of closing the infrastructure gap over 7 years to be $635 billion and 330,000 jobs across this country. The third report, which we released this week, concludes these massive economic benefits are the tip of the iceberg when it comes to socioeconomic benefits for First Nations, particularly related to housing, education, and clean water. Poor housing conditions pose serious health risk to First Nations. And according to the 2021 census, First Nations are 4 times more likely to live in crowded housing than other Canadians, and 6 times more likely to live in a home that needs major repairs. So we welcome Prime Minister Carney's commitment to get Canada back in the business of building houses, but to be successful, they must reflect First Nations perspectives from the start. Access to clean drinking water is another key element of this report we released this week. Inadequate access to housing, water and sanitation systems have been long-standing issues. Prolonged advisories create significant chronic health conditions and erode trust. They often lead to First Nations seeking unsafe alternatives even after boil and water advisories are lifted. It is a shameful situation for a country as rich as ours. All Canadians will benefit from increased productivity, reduced rates of illness and disease in First Nations communities. So in conclusion, we welcome the new government's interest in building much needed infrastructure in this country. However, if the government's vision for First Nations infrastructure is focused exclusively on accessing natural resources on First Nations territories, they have another thing coming. The Prime Minister and the premiers need to start with the basics. We need clean water, quality housing, modern schools, all-season roads, community health and safety for the First Nations of this country. And I think I also have to say this, First Nations, it's disheartening when we can't go to a regular bank like many of you or many of your municipalities. We have to go to the minister to ask for access to that. Every part of our life is structured that way. So I'll leave that there. During his visit, the King said we needed to honor truth and reconciliation in both word and deed. As we all commemorate the 10th year anniversary of the historic Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action this year, what better deed than closing Canada's shameful infrastructure gap once and for all? In a country as rich as Canada, this represents the mother of all Canadian infrastructure and reconciliation projects. The Assembly of First Nations is ready to engage with all of you to demonstrate that we can win by being inclusive, by respecting rights, by respecting our treaties and municipalities too. So let's honor the calls to action. Let's beat Trump. Let's get on with building this beautiful country and finally deliver prosperity for all. Chimigwech.